Well, Eric Nevins, thank you so much for joining me on the Journey of Ruth today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, well, so my name's Eric Nevins. I live in Denver, Colorado with my wife. We just celebrated 25 years. That's
Congratulations.
great. Yeah,
That's amazing.
We both kind of thought, yeah, that's kind of amazing. How did we make it this far? But it's great. It's a good milestone. And then we have 4 kids, and a couple of them are college age, couple of them are in middle school, so that's always an interesting dynamic to deal with. And then I have a podcast, and I serve a group of Christian podcasters that I love very much, and that's kind of what we do.
Yeah. You are the host of the Halfway There podcast. And can you tell us what we can, listeners, what are they expecting when they come to your podcast? What are you talking about over there?
Yeah, so the real promise of my show is that you're going to hear the whole spiritual journey. So I don't know about you, but growing up, when I was a kid, the testimony time, right? Had one basic structure, and that was my life was terrible. Then I met Jesus, and now my life is great, right? It's awesome, except for all the other things that happen in the spiritual journey of walking with God.
Yeah.
You don't really have to read that far in Scripture to see that sometimes it gets messy. And I didn't see that we were talking about that. I actually went to school to study the spiritual journey and to study how do we grow in Christ. And so when I started my show, what I wanted to do was just share that whole picture, because it's actually much longer, deeper, and wider than we were being told. So you're going to get a story of a person who, just an ordinary person. Sometimes they're famous people. I love to interview, people that I get a chance to. I interviewed Brian Zahn this year. I interviewed, my favorite was John Schlitt from Petra. I don't know how old you are if you remember Petra,
gosh, yes,
right? That was I'm a big rock head. I love that. Jamie Rowe from Guardian. So sometimes I get those.
Man.
But then to hear, but I'm looking for their, not so much their music, but their story of how did God kind of work in your life there. So that's what I'm doing with the show.
Yeah, and the interesting thing you say about that here is the I don't know, formula for your testimony.
Yep.
I didn't have that first part because I accepted Christ when I was 5.
Sure.
And
right.
so then I felt like my testimony, and I know there are other people that have this,
Yep.
they feel like their testimony isn't valuable because they didn't struggle first and then get pulled out of it. And it's like, I've kind of just lived this regular life, if you will. Doesn't mean God hasn't shown up, but God didn't save me from this big pit of despair.
Well, and that's one of the things I wanted to address. And one of the things that I get sometimes when I have somebody who has a story like yours, and they're kind of apologetic about, I gave my life to Christ when I was 5 or what. Okay, sure. But walking with the Lord is not just when you were 5, right?
That's
it's
right.
the rest of the story. And that's what I like to talk about. So we'll talk about the dark night of the soul, which is a term I'd never even heard until really I was at least in college, maybe in seminary. But it's God's people have known about it for a very long time. It's just, we need to talk about it. So my goal was really to change the conversation that we're having about what it's like to live life with God. I really want to, people ask me sometimes, how long are you going to do the show for? Well, I'm going to do it for 10 years, 500 episodes. And I wanted to stand for as this sort of testimony of what life with God was like, as kind of an artifact from the 21st century. So we'll see. I don't know. Maybe in 2,592, nobody will be listening to the podcast, but maybe somebody will listen to it and go, oh, that's very interesting. I didn't know they were doing that back then.
Yeah. Okay. So podcasts have really exploded over COVID. Everybody started a podcast, and I know you were doing yours. What year did you start your podcast?
2016.
2016. Okay. Yeah. So I started mine in 2019. So actually right before before COVID, but there are so many podcasts to choose from. And like I said, it seems like everybody has a podcast or has had a podcast and then was like, no, this isn't for me. I'm out. So,
Yep.
can you talk about, you actually created a platform for Christian podcasters. It's called the Christian Podcasters Association. And I think it's a great opportunity for podcasters to come together that are Christians and not only share their newest episodes and their victories. I love when you put the posts up on social media of like, hey, share your victories here. And it's cool to see everybody, the differing people, like, hey, I just posted my 100th episode, or I just
Right.
posted my first episode.
I love
I
that.
just reached so many downloads. I just reached 100,000 downloads, and someone's like, I just finally reached 500. But everyone is cheering each other on. Doesn't matter where. It's not like, oh, well, 500, that's not that great. You understand that when you reach 500 for the first time, you're like, oh my gosh, this is so exciting. Can you talk a little bit about what it's been like to create this community for podcasters, and kind of what even led you to create that?
Yeah. So somebody said to me, I just went to Podcast Movement in Dallas
Yeah.
this a couple weeks ago. It was fantastic. And somebody said to me, who had been around doing the online thing for a long time, he said, being in this podcast community is one of the places, like, it's not like everything else, where if you're a YouTuber, the only thing anybody cares about is your subscribers. If
Hmm.
you're a blogger, the only thing anybody cares about is your email list. With podcasting, it's not really like that. And so the community of podcasting as a whole, I think, is much more holistic and cares much more about you and your message than it does about how many people are listening. It's not, because it's not immediately apparent, and so it
Yeah.
doesn't. There are people who stand out. Everybody. I'd like some of that Joe Rogan money. I don't know about you, but one
Right.
day, right? He signed a $100 million deal. That's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
But most of us aren't like that, and so we
Yeah.
we kind of know that and have this respect. Okay, so that, I think, is sort of inherent within podcasting. But what we didn't have when I started Christian Podcasters Association was a place for Christians to come together and sort of take that same sort of nurturing and cheering one another on from a faith context. And so that's what
Yeah.
I wanted to do. That was way back in 2017. I really just thought there was a whole situation where, in the podcast movement group, actually, somebody asked, like, is there a group for uh, something else, I think. And then I asked, hey, is there a faith-based group or Christian group? And a dude commented and he said, yeah, I'd love that if there was one. I started messaging that guy, and it turns out he lived in my hometown where I grew up.
Okay.
And so we had a lot in common, and his show was a little similar to mine. And so we started talking, and then I just said, you know what, let's go. We're going to do it. And so we started the group. My only goal was to just bring people together, let us help each other. And it's just grown. Now we just have 3,000 people in the group.
That's right.
I offer memberships, I offer coaching. I'm really excited. I'm getting ready to roll out a lower cost membership that has some really cool benefits to it that I'm excited about. I think will
Mm.
serve a lot of people, while also helping us get a little more financially kind of stable, maybe is the right word, so we can do more, which
Yeah.
is what I'm excited about. So
And what people do, everyone always, it cracks me up because when I say I have a podcast, people are like, oh my gosh, that is
I know.
so cool. Like, are you famous? I'm
Right.
like,
Well, that's the thing, is people having a podcast put you in a whole different category, right?
yeah,
So you mentioned that there's a lot of podcasts out there, and there is. I think the last number I saw was like 4 million or 4 million, something like that.
yeah,
But did you know that there's like 600 or 700,000 of those that only have one episode?
yeah.
Those are all those people in during COVID who picked up the Anchor app and were like, I'm going to talk to my phone, which is great. If that's gets you started, I'm fine with that. But they were like, I'm just going to talk this. And they had no idea. They didn't set that foundation of, this is this name. This is the promise that I'm going to make to my audience, which you were wisely asked me about. Right. And then, so all those kinds of foundational things, it actually takes to kind of keep going. When you niche it down and you go to all the shows that either were short term or they've started and stopped because for whatever reason, it's really not that many. And then you get down into the 19 categories. It's so, your competition, you have zero, there's so little competition in podcasting compared to, millions and millions of videos on
On
YouTube,
YouTube.
like,
Yeah.
or blogs or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think, okay, so podcasting does not make you a bunch of money. So if
No,
you
it
know a
doesn't.
podcaster, unless their name is Joe Rogan, they're not making Actually, most podcasters are not making the bulk of their money from their podcast. They're making their money from somewhere else, whether it's coaching or a book or speaking or whatever it might be. That's where they're getting, and they might be getting a little bit of money from their podcast. They might be getting a lot, but usually for the most case, people are not. And so I think that the interesting thing about podcasting is it becomes like a passion project for people because they're not making a lot of money. So they have to almost decide, am I going to continue? I know for me, we've almost quit this several times. Because it's like, is it worth it? Like, what is the time commitment versus the money being made or not being made? You know, how do we rectify that? And is it really worth continuing this podcast? Because sometimes it can feel like a job. What have you maybe kind of pull back the curtain for a little bit into the world of podcasting? What would you hope that those that are listeners to podcasts but are not podcasters would understand about podcasting and maybe these like ideas of what we have about things like, oh, you're famous because you have a podcast, but maybe aren't true?
Yeah, I think people who aren't podcasters don't know how much work it actually takes and the kind of investments that podcasters are actually making. So like, we've both had to invest in microphones, right?
Mm-hmm.
So now there are reasonable, ways to do that, but it's an investment. And so in order to sound decent, right? I have a mixer over here. I had to pay for, well, actually somebody gave this to me. That was really nice of it. But the other ones that
I had to pay for mine. So
right, I had to pay for it. Right.
Yeah.
So I got lights this year because I want to do video. So I had to pay for that. So there's lots of expenses in addition to all that. You have to pay for your website and your hosting, and all that. So there is a lot of cost. I don't think people understand how little feedback you get because they assume that if you have a podcast, you're probably just people are emailing you all the time or giving you feedback, and that's not true.
A lot of times it's crickets. You're like, I think people are liking this.
I'm really happy if I get some likes when I share my episode, right? Like that's kind of it.
And I'll be honest, when people stop me, like I see them in person, like, and so they have to be people that I know, right? Stop me and like, hey, I listened to that episode like 3 weeks ago, and I can't tell you how much that meant to me. And I'm like, thank you.
Means so much, right? That means so much.
Yes,
absolutely.
Yeah,
because that somebody cares about and that what you're doing, matters. So I have this thing that I've started saying is I actually do think you should stop your podcast, but only when God tells you to, right? So if you start your show because you felt like God had put something in your heart that you needed to share, you needed to get out there, then great, that's okay. But you can't stop because you're discouraged, right? You can only stop when He tells you that you can also stop and it's time to move on. There is a time to do that, but until you get to that time, you got to figure it out and you got to continue. And that's a lot up here. It's a mindset game. Podcasting is about personal growth as much as it is audience growth.
I almost feel like that's good life advice. Like, don't stop until God says it's time. It's time to move. Yeah. I mean,
that's why perseverance is so all over the New Testament, right?
That's right.
Read for it. You'll see it.
Yeah, that's so true. Now, the podcasting world, when you are putting a podcast up to go out to Apple Podcasts or Spotify, you get to choose what category your podcast goes underneath. So you could choose to be an entrepreneurship podcast or a business podcast, a parenting podcast. And then you get to choose, are you an explicit podcast? Are you not an explicit podcast? And those get pushed out in different ways. And so because of that, you can go in as a listener and say, well, I want to hear current events, and I want to go listen to a podcast on that. It makes it a little bit easier for the listener to find you. Well, one of the most popular areas is the religion and spirituality. As far as I think that's one of the top, if I remember correctly, it's one of the top. Am I right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's one of the top ones. Why is that? It's so important that we have that kind of label, or I don't know, that overarching idea that we have religious and spiritual podcasts in the podcast world.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. Is so what? So let's just compare two categories, right?
Okay.
True. Let's compare true crime and let's say the Christian category.
I
So
can't do it. I
actually,
can't do true crime because I'm like
I,
walking around my house thinking people are like behind doors. I can't.
but it's so popular, right?
It really is.
I saw Phoebe Judge at Podcast Movement and listened to
Okay.
her speak. Her intonation though, that's another story. I got to figure out where she comes from, but she but so true crime is
Yeah.
really popular, right?
Yes.
But it's got the least number of shows and has the most listens.
Mm.
Well, the inverse of that is actually Christianity that has the most number of shows and the least listens. And so I'm on a mission to fix that because the reason that's happening is because a lot of pastors are using podcasting as their 21st century tape ministry, right? They're taking
Yes.
their sermons and they're just reposting them, putting some music, or some of them, like I heard one from a guy I met at Podcast Movement. It's really well produced, and it could probably is on the radio somewhere too. I don't know, but it's basically sermons. It's not really content that he's making for particular people. He's making it for his church, and then he's
When you
sharing it
search
so people
Journey
can
of
listen.
Ruth, you get several sermon series on Ruth.
I bet you do.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Mm-hmm.
totally right.
Yep.
So that's okay. I'm okay with that. But those generally don't do very well in terms of listens.
Mm-hmm.
So what I'd like to see and what I'm working toward is uh, a category where a lot of people who work in a lot of different niches, and maybe your niche isn't Christianity, right? And maybe it's not religion, spirituality. One of my favorite examples of this is always A Quilter's Life by Paula Chamberlain. She's one of our CPA Gold members, and
Okay.
it's all about quilting. But she doesn't always talk about the Lord. It's not like, oh, we're gonna sit and quilt and talk about Jesus. No, it's we're talking about the hobby of quilting and why we like it. And she has a phrase: every quilt has a story. That's so great.
It is great.
She gets those stories, but when she has a chance, she brings the gospel to bear on quilting,
Mm.
and that's fantastic. So you ask a question like, how do we? Why is it important that Christians are involved in podcasting? That's why, because we get a chance, whatever your niche, whether your business, whether you're whatever it is, even true crime. I know a true crime Christian podcaster.
Yes.
Yeah, right. So
Mm-hmm.
you can bring the gospel to bear, the kingdom of God that Jesus talks about to bear on that genre. That's what we're supposed to do. And I
Mm-hmm.
think it has tremendous benefits for you and of course also for your audience.
So I know that if you are a Christian in your business, there's a potential that you are a minority, right? In that sense of you may be one of only a couple believers in your workspace. And even though there are a lot of Christianity podcasts out there, like you said, a lot of them are just pastors throwing that up. So they're not the ones that are going to podcast movement. They're not the ones that are, on these boards that are making decisions about podcasts or whatever. What are some interesting things that you have discovered as a leader or someone who is attempting to see change happen in the podcast world and who is discipling? You really are like taking podcasters coming in and discipling and mentoring them. What are some of the challenges that you see Christian podcasters facing in a podcast world that maybe is like, well, you know, I'm upset because of this aspect of your show, just like we can upset anybody.
Yeah,
You can
totally.
upset people really easily in today's society. What are the challenges that you're seeing Christian podcasters face?
Yeah, I think there's a lot. I think I'm trying to decide which way to go. So it's first thing that comes to mind is I think there's a lot of podcasters, Christian podcasters, who want to do a teaching podcast,
Okay.
where they're teaching the Bible. And if you're called to that, and and you've studied it, that's a good way for you to do
It's
that.
a good place to start. Study
I
the thing.
I don't know that everybody, but it's okay to make a show where you're like, I'm going to learn how to study the Bible, or I'm going
Mm,
to study it, and I'm going to share what I've got. Like there's room. That's one of the cool things about podcasting, right? Is you can bring people on a journey with you, and that's okay.
true. Mm-hmm.
I get a little worried sometimes about uh you know we got to be careful with how we handle scripture, particularly, and not every application is always appropriate. That comes from biblical studies, kind of.
And these episodes are out there. So like
Are.
if you are speaking heresy, like more and more people can listen to it and pick it up.
Yeah, and even if you just make a bad application, I mean, there's so many. uh, There may be an application that's good for you, but that's not right for a
Mm,
broader audience, and
well,
sometimes that's we just gotta be careful how we do that.
mm,
The other one that really is troubling to me at the moment is politics. We see a lot of people want to talk about, for instance, the Roe decision and some of those kinds of things. And I get it. There's room for that. When I graduated seminary, I'm gonna go back to tell you why I care about this so much. I started a blog about Christians and politics because I love politics. I probably every day I'm reading some sort of commentary, some sort of
okay.
op-ed, and I've been that way for a long time. But I realize it can be really toxic, right? There's a lot
Mm,
going on in our country right now, and there's a lot of people who have kind of conflated the kingdom of God and the kingdom of the United States of America, if I can put it that way.
yeah.
And the two are not the same. So as much as we need to work for justice, and we need to work for mercy, and we need to work for care of the least of these politically, a political victory does not equal necessarily a victory for the kingdom of God. And so I think we have to keep that
Mm,
in mind. I'd love to see less Christians. I want to see the people involved in politics working in those institutions where they need to, less opining about it, because I think it's doing a lot of damage to what we're actually called to do and what we need to be about.
so more action, less talking about it.
Yeah, and this is why you'll notice in the Facebook group, I don't allow any political discussions. There are other groups that do, or even theological discussions, because we have people from all over the spectrum, both spectrums. And look, those are all very personal decisions. There's great if you want to have that conversation on your show, but we don't need to debate it. That's not what the group is about. It's about supporting one another.
Yep. I okay, so you've created the space online for the mentorship of podcasters in Christian Podcasters Association. Why do podcasters specifically need this mentorship? Why is it so important that we're not just like, okay, I can just do this on my own, put our blinders on and just go for it? Why is mentorship or discipleship, a community of podcasters, so important?
Yeah, well, I mean, you could, but then you're gonna be lonely, right? Like that's
Yeah.
what was the case for me. Like I was really lonely, and I was like, I need to find more Christian podcasters. But there was a great example this week. I didn't ask her permission to share this, but one of our gold members had a trouble with her website, and
Mm.
she was so frustrated, and so she posted that with the gold community. And we all were like, hey, do you need a solution, or just need a listening ear? Do you need,
It's
I'm
nice of
so
you guys
sorry
to
that
ask
happened.
before you just start
Yeah,
throwing
and
stuff out there.
gave her some empathy, um and she was able to figure it out, right? That's how it works. But uh just to have a community where people care about the struggles and understand the struggles. Somebody else
Mm-hmm.
in there recently said, I love this group because you guys get it, right? Your family doesn't get it. Your family probably does not care about your podcast as much as you do, and they're probably tired of you talking about it. I know
Yeah.
mine is, right?
Yep.
But uh but it is the thing that is is me, and where I've learned so much about who I am by getting behind the mic and just starting to talk. So
Mm-hmm.
it's it's great to have a group of people that understand the trials and tribulations of being a podcaster.
Yeah, and I mean that's the same for moms. For,
Yep.
in fact, I just had this conversation about pastors' wives, finding other
Hmm.
pastors' wives, and understand that because they understand the, challenges that you're going through. And when you I think sometimes when you've got a community that doesn't quite understand, when you experience a victory, they're like, "Oh, congratulations!" You're like, "No, this is a big deal. I need you to
Right.
like, can we try that again?" And you can act like, have a bigger response.
I know. I know. When I get a guest, there's nothing quite like when you get a guest that you're just thrilled to get, right?
Yeah.
So my most recent one, I hope this happens. I don't have it booked yet, but I reached out about getting Richard Foster on my show. Like
Oh, cool.
that, whoa, that's gonna be, he's one of my mentors, right? Or I
Uh
got
huh.
this year I interviewed James Brand Smith, right? That dude, Rich Mullins lived in his attic, he told me, for 2 years. It's like, what? Really? I'm so jealous. Why do you get to, anyway. But that was it was talking to people like that, right?
Yeah.
And getting that guest, getting a book is so exciting. And then if your family doesn't care, right? You're like,
I had my guest. I mean, she was on my. Another podcast uses this. Their Mount Rushmore of podcasting. Like, who are the 4 people that you would
yeah,
love to have? And she was one of those because being a discipleship podcast, she wrote a discipleship book that I had been
yeah,
teaching in my church for almost 5 years at that point in time. So when I reached out and she said yes, I emailed specific, right, like 4 friends that I knew. They knew who she was, they knew how big of a deal it was. I'm like, because I can put this on Facebook and people be like, great, I don't know who that is, and they're like, oh, that's so exciting.
yes.
So I totally understand. Tell us how we can support those people that are podcasters. If we have friends that are podcasters, what is like one thing, maybe 2, that you can do that is going to support your friends that you may not think of?
Yeah. So the first one is follow their page, right? And when you
Yes.
share the episode, please reshare it. That'd be awesome.
Yeah.
Interact with it on social. I mean, that's free and it just takes a few seconds and it really helps a ton. So
Mm-hmm.
that's one thing. If you have the wherewithal and you can support a Patreon at $10 a month, $20 a month, I have some really great friends who support me at what I would consider almost obscene levels. I can't believe that I have friends who give me uh, as much money as they do. But they're
I'm the same.
great. They love what I do and they
Yeah.
want to keep it rolling, and they have helped so much over the last 3-4 years. So if you can do that, do it. If you have a friend or somebody who can support through Patreon or however you do it, that goes a really long way to affirming what you're doing. And well, not all of life is about money, but boy, money does help keep things going, right? Sometimes.
Yeah. Well, and I know for us here in this household, this is the first year where the podcast is making enough money to actually cover its own expenses.
There you go.
Is it
Right.
making buku bucks? No.
Right.
But this will be the first year where it's actually like in the black, and we as a family are not having to put forward money to pay for the podcast.
Right.
And it's taken time to build. I think that's another thing that people don't understand is that
Yes.
it really is a grind to have success as a podcast. I don't even consider my podcast necessarily successful. I think we're still building, but it's a grind, and you have to just really stay consistent. Consistency is key. I see that on
Yep.
so many, pages about, well, what do we need to do as podcasters? Just be consistent, and keep going. But it takes a long time. So it's pretty easy to feel discouraged at some point along the process. And so having friends that are sharing like, oh my gosh, I loved this episode. Everyone go check this out. Or like you said,
It
$5
means a lot.
down. It
Yep.
does. It does.
So
Yeah.
yeah, one thing I agree with you. It is absolutely a long game, right? I've said that a lot because you and I probably didn't have anybody following us before we started, right?
No.
And so we keep mentioning Joe Rogan. There's somebody else. I don't know who. Adam
Jamie Ivy,
Carolla.
Annie F.
Yeah,
Downs, those. Yeah.
right. And they maybe didn't early on either, but they've been doing it so long, right? And
Mm-hmm.
they do a whole bunch. They have whole teams of people
They do.
who do their stuff and their social and all
Mm-hmm.
that. So it makes sense that it's going to take longer to get some traction. Uh, I feel like there's something that happened for me. I don't tell me if you felt this way too. When I hit 100 episodes, that was when I felt like all of a sudden, even though I would get some publishers before then, it started to be more publishers would reach out to me.
Mm-hmm.
They would say, okay, it felt like something shifted. Maybe it was just in me, but it was people started to go, okay, the show's not going to go away. The show
Mm-hmm.
isn't. The show is actually they're doing the work. They're showing up. They're
Yeah.
gonna keep promoting people, and so it was a safer bet. I think but that's 2 years, right? If you're publishing every day or
Yeah.
every week, that's 2 years of publishing your podcast before you really get that traction. Which is why I encourage people to measure momentum. So measure your growth uh, week to week and month to month
Hmm.
versus just looking at downloads of every single episode. Measure, like, if you start out and you get, I remember getting 12 downloads a day, right? Like
Yeah.
I
Yep.
I remember that, and today it's quite a bit more, right? Because
Yeah.
there's more to see, there's more to download. But
I remember when I saw that consistently my downloads didn't usually drop below 7. Like
yeah,
the day the podcast comes out, you're going to get a lot of listens, right? But then it's going to taper out like towards the end of the week. And I'm like, look, I'm not going below. I'm getting at least 7 listens every day,
yep.
right?
I,
and
I tried
mhm.
I tried to measure how many days does it take me to get to 100 downloads, and
Mm,
then how many days does it take me to get to 1,000 downloads,
mhm.
and and then I watch those days shrink. Hopefully, the number of days
Yeah.
over time.
I think for me, it has been almost. I say this. It's almost legitimized me. That's what I think the 100 episodes did. Is
Yeah.
it brought legitimacy to the journey of Ruth and to the message that the journey of Ruth had. Because people could go back and listen and see that there is a track record in talking about discipleship and that our message hasn't changed
Yep.
and that it has been the same since the beginning. Now, the podcast is not the same. You listen back and I mean, it's an art
Right.
form. So I have gotten better than when I started, for sure. And if you
Totally.
look back at even like Jamie Ivey, you listen back to her very first podcast, it's her and her friend recording a phone call. That was her first episode. And I'm like,
Right.
oh my gosh, that's awesome. That's before there were things like Anchor that has like the ability for you to record on your phone. She was using another app that allowed her to do that. And her friend's like in the car driving.
Yeah. One of my early ones was using like freeconferencecall.com or something like that, talking to a guy because I didn't have the equipment to do a Zoom
Uh-huh.
or whatever. And it's terrible. I don't think it's available anymore because I went over 300. So Apple only shows
Right.
300. But yeah, but the key is to get started. And that's the thing that I think a lot of people miss. So get started and then be consistent and just iterate. One of the best things I've learned a lot more about this recently, but was to iterate and to grow. And I've got this I've got this post-it that says version on it
Okay.
because I'm in a coaching call with my coach back then. That's what he taught me. He's like, always do version 1. You don't have to do version 10 now. Do version 1, and then you can change it and do version 2. And it's a great wisdom.
And I think sometimes my personality says, well, I can't do it perfect, so I'm not going to do it.
Right. Me
And
too.
sometimes the imperfect version 1, you learn so much from that then version 2 can be so much better. We started adding to YouTube this last August, but we were already, or I'm sorry, I guess it was a year ago, August, but we were already 2 years in. And then
Yep.
it was like, there is no way I could have added YouTube to version 1. The learning curve was so steep. Like I didn't have the time to do that. Well, once I'd kind of figured out a little bit more of like a method and a path as I'm editing and recording, then here 2 years in, I was finally able to like add YouTube, add the
Yep.
lights, add the
Yep.
all those types of things that I needed, and I could actually put another way of getting the podcast out there in. But I feel like sometimes it feels like, okay, I have to do YouTube. I have to get my podcast out on every single platform. I have to make sure that I am posting every single day. I'm adding a reel. And it's like, if you will just take, I like your idea, version 1, and then version 2, once you've got version 1 kind of figured out, then version 2 can be created. And you've learned just from what
Yep.
you've created.
You can iterate, right? You can do the next iteration
Yep.
as you go. And so I try to do one thing every quarter for my show.
Okay.
I think we've gotten, but the audio quality is good and like those kinds of things. But so the next one I need to add is doing this, is turn on the lights and let's do some video, and let's actually, I'm going to get a program called Ecamm. It's a long story, but there's all these, right, that instead of Zoom, so to kind of
Yes.
upgrade that, or maybe Rivers, I don't know, we'll see, but get one of those. And then, so let's do that a little differently. And then
Mm-hmm.
we can live stream at the same time. There's a whole process to that, but it's just skills. And once I switch from like goals to skills and say, okay,
Mm.
I can I can learn the skill of doing audio, and then I can learn the skill of doing video.
Mm-hmm.
That's a separate thing. It's no longer about whether I'm good enough. It's about, what have I learned it yet?
Yeah.
And
Well,
that's the
and
difference
that,
between a growth and a fixed mindset.
say that again.
That's the difference between a growth and a fixed mindset.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Is that idea that you can learn something. So it's not just about what you know, but it's about also what you can learn.
Yep.
That's been, that's hard for me. I want to know if you have any fails that you have experienced as a podcaster.
Oh, so many. Um, I've deleted, interviews. I've done interviews I didn't want to publish. I had one, the worst one. Oh, this is terrible. So in the worst is when you're like recording and you run out of space or something. So
Yes.
I think that happened to me. I was interviewing a guy, one of my first Zoom interviews, and I was like, oh no, I didn't realize that was a thing. And so I lost it. I had to interview him again. Actually, my very first episode, I interviewed a woman named Carolyn Schmidt
Okay.
in this echoey little room. And I just had this little digital recorder that I sat between us, like that's
Uh-huh.
not going to be
Yeah.
good at all. And, and I armed it, but I didn't hit record. And so we had this wonderful conversation about her story, and nobody will ever hear it.
Oh my gosh.
She was kind enough to do it again with me. Like we
Oh, that's good.
went to a different room actually, which was good. And anyway, we did it. One of my worst, this is one I was thinking of, is I interviewed my grandmothers in 2020
That's
to get
awesome.
their story. It was amazing, and I had so much more respect for them after hearing some of their stories. It was kind of, well, it was all those questions that you just don't get to ask
Mm-hmm.
most of the time, right?
Yeah.
And so I learned so much. But my mom, one of them, I had, uh, I ran out of space. I think it died like toward the end. We were already almost done, but there was a little bit that I missed there. I was like, oh no. I think I missed my wrap up
Mm.
mostly, was the thing, but
Yeah.
it was kind of like, that's not good.
I used to record on my phone, and
Yeah.
I believe it was my first recording. I said, I'm just going to record on my phone and this little handheld recorder thing. But I didn't have two channels. So it was like I was recording
Right.
them on the handheld recorder, and then I was recording, I think it was them on the phone and me on the recorder. And in the middle of the recording, someone called. My dad called.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
and it completely corrupted the file. Like I looked at it and I'm like, oh, it's still running. We're good. So we did the rest of the recording,
Oh no.
and it corrupted the file. And the funny thing is that is my biggest fail. I was interviewing my aunt. So what is it about family? Like,
Right. Something. I don't know.
something. I had to email. We had to do that interview 3 times. And
Oh
the
no.
third one is the one that's actually aired because it
But
messed up.
this is why I say, though, it's about personal growth, not about audience growth, right? Because
Yeah.
I bet you learn some things. You're not
Yeah.
going to probably do any of those things again,
No.
but you also persevered through it,
Yeah.
right? And you were able to go, okay, I'm not going to stop. Some people would stop there and go, I'm not good at this, whatever. But you got through it, and you decided you were going to keep podcasting, and you got you got some different stuff probably in that third
Mhm.
interview than you got in the other two.
Yeah.
But you still published it and you put it out there because you had this vision that you wanted to see.
Mm-hmm.
And there's so much value to just pushing through to that stuff.
Yep. Yeah. I think that not only are, you're a different person for sure. And you're learning, but also I have realized that people have a lot more grace than I assumed they did. When I mess
Right.
up things or mess up an interview, it is like the worst to have to like call them and say, I'm so sorry, but it's gone. Like the conversation is gone or it's corrupt. and to have them say, okay, when are we going to interview again? When are we going to do the recording again? And I'm like, thank you. You know, my aunt was so sweet. She just said, well, I guess that wasn't the conversation God wanted everyone to hear.
Yeah, there you
Like,
go. That's
yeah,
helpful.
let's not say that I'm the one that messed it up. Let's say it was God's intent. Let's go with that. But the grace that people have with you as you're doing your art form,
Yep.
I think is really has been encouraging for me.
That's pretty interesting, actually. That's a great point. I've definitely found that I'm much more willing to say things I haven't said before, or say things I haven't thought before than I used to be. And I used to be really kind of apologetic or like not unsure about that.
Yeah.
And I still feel that way when I'm on stage. I don't like speaking that well. I'd like to do that more, but I haven't got that skill yet, right? So,
Yeah.
but behind a mic, totally different story. I can get going and we can talk and it'll be fine.
Interesting. See, and I'm
Even
like,
if I mess up.
yeah, right. And that's been interesting too, of the difference of, do you edit or do you not? And there's a different perspective there, I think.
I totally edit. That's I go for it. I'm not of the school that I need to edit every little thing, but I will make sure there are no like sniffles, coughs, things that are just kind of obnoxious in your ear. I don't even take out all the ums, so sorry. I've been saying a lot, but I don't do that.
I don't take them out.
Yeah, there's space. I think people talk that way and they expect to hear some of that.
Yeah.
But some people get really excited about it. I don't care that much.
It was YouTube that caused me to stop editing so much, because you can tell when someone edits a video, where audio, you can hear and be like, oh my gosh, these people are like seamless. They're like, their conversation is perfect. They never make any mistakes. They never, stumble over their words. And you're like, no, actually they edited it out. And if you have a good editor, then you can't tell that conversation, or that they cut out 5 minutes worth of conversation.
Right. I cut out things like when I ramble before a question and I'm trying to ask a question. I don't know what the question is yet.
Oh, good.
So
I'm so glad I'm not the only one that does that.
I take those out. I take out if the guest is trying to fish for their answer. Sometimes you can tell that is happening. So I'll sometimes cut that out and bring it to, which is why people think that other people are so articulate, right? Because it's like you ask a question and they're and then dive right into it. That's because I edited it. It's not because they're always that sharp.
That's right.
Okay.
No, I mean, and I think it's part of our job as podcasters to make our guests sound better than better than they are.
I'm counting on you. I'm counting on you, Courtney, to make me sound good.
Oh, there's high expectations. Oh boy. Well, thank you so much for kind of opening, I think, kind of pulling back the curtain a little bit on podcasting for us and for listeners that maybe don't really know much about. We all know that podcasts exist, but unless you are a podcaster, the idea of how things come to fruition and how things are created, that can be a little shady and uncertain. So thank you for giving us insight into that. Where can we get a hold of the Halfway There podcast, or get a hold of you?
Yes. So Halfway There is anywhere you get your podcasts. So you just go search Halfway There podcast or my name. I did find there's like some guys who are doing a middle-aged man podcast called Halfway There. That's so
okay.
Just ignore that. You'll see my show Halfway There. It's good. So that's wherever you go. My website is ericnevins.com. So that's a great place. If you are a Christian podcaster and you want to join Christian Podcasters Association, this is too many asks, but if that's you, it's christianpodcastersassociation.com as well.
Yeah.
Or you can find us on Facebook. I do want to say, Courtney, I love your show. I love that your emphasis on discipleship. I think it's so very needed. I think podcasting really fits that, as not only for listeners, because we can, you can learn as you're listening, but also for podcasters. So thanks for doing what you do.
Thank you so much. That's so kind of you. I know that it's, I love getting to podcast as much as you love podcasting. So thank you for that encouragement. The last question that we ask all of our guests is that, because none of us are meant to live alone, and you don't let us podcasters live alone, you've given us a community. Who is it that has helped you along in your journey?
Oh man. Well, there's so many people, but the first people that I thought of, I guess oddly enough, not related to podcasting, but the best thing that ever happened to me is when I went to seminary. Not the best thing. I mean, it's one of the best things in this category. You know what I mean?
Uh-huh.
Was one of the reasons I went to Denver Seminary is because they have a mentorship program,
Love it.
and I had to meet for like a year and a half with a pastor, a pastoral mentor, because I was an MDiv student and wanted to be a pastor. So I had to meet with a pastor and I had to meet with a lay person as well,
Okay.
almost every couple times a month. And those people, I still talk to my lay mentor a lot, or occasionally, I guess. Not as much. He moved out of town. We used to still have beer and chips and dip, like sometimes, chips and salsa,
Perfect.
which was great. But they invested in me and told me that I had something to say and told me that I had, um, a vision and that it was worth going after.
Mm,
So you never know. Like you never know the impact of just spending a little time with people. Now that was a
that's
long
right.
time that they spent with me, but I'm so grateful for them
Mm-hmm.
because of that.
That's awesome. I think we never really understand the legacy that we are living on a daily
No way.
basis when we're doing just those small little things.
So I gotta relate that back to podcasting because
Yeah,
you'll get downloads from places in the world you'll probably never step foot, right?
it's true.
And you have no idea the kinds of impacts that you're having in the ripples. I call them ripples of the gospel, right?
Yeah.
Where like a stone dropped into the water and it just ripples out. You don't know where it ends because you can't see it, but God does. And so we have to leave all that up to him. He'll figure it out, but hopefully you'll get this message in the right earbuds at the right time.
Mm-hmm.
But it's kind of amazing when you think about it that way.
It is. And just to know that what you're going to be saying, you don't know who is going to hear it. You don't know who's going to listen to it. And you don't know how it's going to impact people. Because one thing for this person over here is really impactful, and the other person's like, yeah, it was a good episode, but I didn't really get anything out of it.
Right.
And then the next episode, it flips, and that person's in tears or driving down the road. That's always the struggle with podcasts is when you're driving.
Try not to make people cry.
Right, exactly. But that puts them in tears, and I think that has actually removed from me some of the pressure to make sure every episode is worth something, because I'm like, it's worth something to someone. If I'm listening to it and I'm like, I think that the Lord has kind of given us this platform to talk about this subject. It's gonna provide something important or some wisdom for somebody, not for everybody, but for somebody for sure. So
Yeah, absolutely.
well, thank you, Eric. I really appreciate you coming on the Journey, Ruth, today. It's been wonderful talking with you.
Thanks for having me, Courtney. You're doing a great work here. I appreciate it.
Thank you.